Hi there, I hope you're doing okay. This is my first video in hopefully a series on Streetcar named Desire, and I'm going to try and do a video for you for each scene of the play, and we'll see how we get along. I just wanted to start, since this is the scene 1 video, with just a bit of an introduction in terms of what I'm aiming to do, what I'm aiming to help you with, what these videos will look like. So I'll start with a few principles. First of all, I'm not making these videos to give you the answers. We've talked quite a lot in English, haven't we, about there's no such thing as the answers. What I want to do really is talk you through some ideas about the scene, some things that you might have thought of, some things that you might not have thought of, and things that you can talk about in terms of the play if you're going to write about it. So that's the first thing. This is not the answers, this is just some ideas. Secondly, I want to try and keep these videos fairly short, so I'm going to aim for all of them to be under 10 minutes. We'll see how that goes. This one might be a bit longer because we're already 1 minute in with my introduction, but in general I want to keep them reasonably short so that there's a chance that you watch them all the way through. And thirdly, what I'm going to be doing is mainly talking about conflict, because in your exam you'll be talking about conflict no matter kind of which scene you get. In the exam, what happens is you're given an extract to read that's a couple of pages long, and you'll be asked how Williams presents a certain type of conflict in the extract that you're given, but you are expected to talk about the whole play and know the whole play in detail. So I'm going to talk about conflict. I'm going to generally just talk about each scene, starting with a summary of what happens, and then talk about where the sources of conflict might be, and then also talk a little bit about some of the methods that Williams is using, some of the contexts that he's writing in. So that's my introduction. I hope that makes sense to you. We're a couple of minutes in now, and I'll try and talk to you a little bit about each scene as we go along. So this is scene 1. So unsurprisingly, the main thing to think about with scene 1 is that this is Williams introducing the play, setting the scene, telling you things that are going to be important about the main 3 characters. We don't meet Mitch yet, other than very fleetingly at the beginning, but the main 3 characters, Blanche, Stanley and Stella, are all introduced. Just very briefly, what happens is we start with Blanche's arrival in the middle of this kind of busy city. Blanche is incongruous to the setting, in Williams's words. On page 3 it says her appearance is incongruous to this setting. That means she doesn't fit in. And in scene 1, most of the conflict is going to derive from the idea that Blanche does not fit in here. And we'll talk about the reasons why that is as we go along. So that's going to be one of the main things that Williams wants to establish in scene 1, that Blanche doesn't fit in, and that's going to be a source of conflict. We see her chatting with Eunice, in which we get that sense that she doesn't really fit in. We see her then reuniting with Stella after quite a while, and we get some clues as to what's happening with Blanche here. If we've read the whole play, what we know is that Blanche was a teacher, lost her job in disgrace, was almost kind of run out of town with her reputation, and now has got nowhere to go, so is staying with Stella. We get hints of that in scene 1 straight away, although we don't find out fully that information about why she's there, but we get the sense that she's nervous and that something's gone wrong. In this reunion with Stella, her sister, who's just married Stanley, we get the sense that they've not seen each other for a while, and there's a bit of awkwardness. That's the first thing that we get. And then as the scene progresses, we see why there's awkwardness, which is that Blanche has lost Belle-Rive, which is their big place in the country with the big white columns. It's their kind of ancestral home, and Blanche has lost it, and she wants to admit to Stella that she's got nowhere to go and she's lost the house and the inheritance. Blanche feels guilty about that, which is partly where the awkwardness and conflict comes from, but she also feels resentful towards Stella because Stella left her there and went off to marry Stanley and left Blanche to deal with kind of the mess of their family. At the end of scene 1, we also get Stanley and Blanche having a conversation together, and we see some of the tensions there starting to get established between the 2 of these characters. So that's a little summary of scene 1. In terms of sources of conflict, I think we've got awkwardness between Blanche and Stella, because Blanche doesn't fit in this place. We've got the issue of Belle-Reve, which Blanche feels guilt for and resentment for towards Stella. And then we get a kind of a weird sexual tension between Stanley and Blanche at the end of the scene, and that is also kind of a slight source of conflict. So, things to look out for in terms of how Williams is presenting that conflict. As I said, most of the things that Williams does in terms of his patterns and in terms of his the things that he's trying to achieve is to achieve this idea that Blanche doesn't fit in, and that's where the conflict comes from. So a good place to look for scene 1 is looking at page 3, where you've got the fact that she's wearing a fluffy bodice, necklace, earrings, white gloves, hat, as if she were arriving at a summer tea or cocktail party, and all of that is there in this place where the sailors, there's a sailor running around, there's a vendor shouting red hot, red hot. It's a chaotic place, and Blanche has come in. So we establish straight away that in some ways this is a play about class, because Blanche is upper class and this place is kind of lower class, and Blanche notices that immediately. In terms of the way the conflict happens between Stella and Blanche, it's all quite low key, and it comes from Blanche. So Blanche conveys to Stella with this kind of false politeness that she's not very happy with kind of the way Stella is living. So for example, on page 7, she says, only Mr. Edgar Allan Poe could do it justice. Out there, I suppose, is the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. Edgar Allan Poe is a horror writer, so she's kind of like saying that she's come into Stella's new house and it's like being in a horror story. It's a highbrow literary reference, isn't it? Which again gives you this idea that Blanche is higher class than Stanley and higher class than this kind of area that she's been forced into. There's lots of other little things. She talks about the bed. She's kind of like, is this it? Oh, I don't like a bed that gives much. She kind of slightly insults Blanche on page 8. You've put on some weight, yes, you're just as plump as a little partridge. You just have to watch it round the hips a little. So that's on page 8. So maybe some of the conflict between them is even coming out right at this early stage, as Blanche kind of feels insecure and feels she has to slightly insult Stella's appearance in order to make herself feel better. And then what we get is that building up to Blanche's rant on page 12, where she, I guess because she's feeling defensive about the loss of Belle-Reve, she blames it on Stella, and the whole of page 12 is taken up by this kind of big monologue from Blanche, where she's talking about how terrible it was when Stella ran off to marry Stanley and left her alone with the dying relatives and the house. In terms of methods, the things to look out for, I think for patterns, you're going to want to look at the way Blanche is behaving in the stage directions. So there's lots of verbs in the stage directions which are talking about this awkwardness. So right on page 7, looking down on the glass, which shakes in her hand. Then page 8, page 9, she touches her forehead shakily. They both laugh uncomfortably. If you think about what Williams is doing in the stage directions, there's lots of verbs and often adverbs. She laughs uncomfortably, which give us this sense that although this is supposed to be a happy reunion between the sisters, there's kind of awkwardness going on underneath it. In terms of the moment where Blanche actually lets rip and actually the conflict becomes kind of on the surface, you've got a massive semantic field of misery and death. Blanche keeps repeating the word funerals on page 12 throughout that, and she talks about struggle for breath, bleeding. Funerals are quiet, but death's not always. Sometimes it rattles, sometimes they cry out. 100 to pay for her coffin. There's a big semantic field of kind of death and decay in that little rant from Blanche, which is giving you this idea that she is kind of resentful of Stella for leaving her amongst all of this death. Another thing that Williams does with Blanche quite a lot, another pattern to look out for in scene 1, is the short exclamatory sentences from Blanche, which is giving you her sense of anxiety and her sense of kind of uncomfortableness. So page 9, for example, oh, you do have a bathroom, exclamation mark. But Stella, I don't see where you're going to put me, exclamation mark. A lot of the time Blanche speaks in exclamatories. 11, page 11, I knew you would, Stella, I knew you would take this attitude about it, exclamation mark. Loads of exclamation marks and short minor sentences in the rant on page 12. I took the blows in my face and my body. All of those deaths, the long parade to the graveyard, father, mother, Margaret, that dreadful way, all of that is exclamatory and really short. It's giving this sense that Blanche is so upset that she's kind of breathless and kind of, she's really blaming Stella, and by the end of it Stella is crying and she runs out. So that's some of the stuff from scene 1. If you have a look just very quickly, because I'm just slightly aware of promising a 10-minute video, I said this one might go up to 12, so I've got 1 more minute to just have a quick look at Stanley and Blanche. This is the first time they talk to each other, and there's a weird sense of sexual tension there, isn't there? He comes in and then he removes his shirt straight away. My clothes are sticking to me. Do you mind if I make myself comfortable? He starts to remove his shirt. There's not the sense at this point of the hatred that's going to come between the two characters later on, and it's quite interesting that Williams begins the play with almost the kind of this electricity between them at this point. If the way he's written it, if you look at it, it's kind of lots of questions and answers. So Stanley's very much in control of the conversation. You're a teacher, aren't you? Yes. What do you teach, Blanche? English. How long are you here for, Blanche? I don't know yet. You going to shack up here? I thought I would. So there's lots of the kind of a big exchange, but Stanley's in control of it through those interrogatives, and Blanche almost gives these kind of one-sentence answers. So you could talk about the symbolism of Stanley taking his shirt off here as almost kind of a little show of dominance straight away over Blanche, and we'll see that much more as we go through the play. So what I thought I would do very quickly is just finish off by talking a little bit about patterns in scene 1 that you might want to look for yourselves. The questions that I sent by email should be doing this already, and you might have some notes that are more comprehensive than this. But what I've done is I've put them on little post-it notes so that you can make some notes as we go along, and then we'll finish the video. So I was thinking for scene 1, you've got this, the use of verbs and adverbs in the stage directions. If you want to talk about patterns of methods that Williams is using, that's always a good thing to look for. The use of exclamatory sentences, especially from Blanche, especially when she's kind of agitated or nervous or awkward. One that I've not mentioned but is worth looking at is the low frequency lexis that Blanche uses. Just to remind you, low frequency lexis basically means long words. This idea of low frequency words that are not used very commonly. That's part of what Williams' strategy of making Blanche seem like she's out of place. Blanche talks with long words. She was an English teacher, so she talks like an English teacher in the sense that she has quite an extensive vocabulary and shows that off. And lastly, you'd want to look always at the use of symbolism and metaphor in that scene. So, for example, Williams establishes motifs that he's going to come back to throughout the play, in terms of whiteness and lightness. So throughout this play, there's this idea of whiteness and lightness symbolising purity, especially sexual purity. Obviously, Blanche's name, which we find out later in the play, she talks about, but Blanche obviously is French for white. And so you've got this kind of idea of Blanche presenting this kind of purity of femininity, but she's also described as being like a moth, isn't she? So she's like a moth going to a flame. That's a really big symbol that almost symbolises her trajectory in the play, that she's this moth going to a flame. So she's attracted to these things that will ultimately destroy her, and that's established very early on in that scene. Definitely Stanley taking his top off at the end of page 14 is like a symbol of his kind of dominance and his like overt sexual aggression, which will almost foreshadows what happens at the end where he rapes Blanche. So there's a lot going on in scene 1 in terms of Williams starting to establish what these characters are like, what the conflicts are going to be about, and symbols that he's going to use to present that. So this was a 15-minute video. The others should be shorter because of that introduction. I hope that was useful. It was a quick kind of whistle-stop tour. That's what they're going to be. Thanks very much.